My name's Charlie.
I'm Madison.
And I'm Joe.
So yeah, we were tasked with looking at the forest and how, if the stream were daylit, how the forest would interact with that process. And so as we began going through this studio process, we started framing our ideas around this idea of mending the watershed. And we quickly realized it wasn't just the creek or the forest, but it was this larger idea of the watershed that's really going to set up this forest for the future. And so as we did that, we kind of identified sort of our three guiding North Stars here through our design. And it's a simple yet profound relationship that is happening in the forest. The creek exists because of the seeps. It's not surface flow that's feeding the creek, it's groundwater infiltrating in the surrounding neighborhood and dripping through this subterranean layer of saturated earth. And so you have, there's the creek. And then the creek makes it possible for the forest to grow, right? Because that's where the water is coming from. So you have the forest and all those plant communities, which in turn will provide shade to the creek, which is an important thing for salmon to exist in the water. And right, the wildlife then live in the water, liven up that ecosystem, and then when they reach the ends of their lives, they put nitrogen back into the forest to feed the trees. So that's just one example of this profound relationship that's happening in the forest, and these three things are going to show up as we move through our designs.
Great. So this board is generally our concept of moving from the neighborhood into the forest of how we imagine supporting water, plant communities, and animals, particularly salmon in our proposed design. So we have existing conditions up top, a lot of hardscaping, so houses, asphalt roadways, paved parking lots, particularly focusing on the Schmitz Park School. We have a large paved parking lot. And currently there's water that's feeding into the underground and feeding through seeps into the creek. There's not a lot of runoff that's actually feeding the creek, it's all of these underground seeps. So we were thinking, particularly in the climate future, as climate change is posing kind of a more and more imminent threat, how do we kind of increase the water that's going into the forest, ensure that these trees, particularly native species that rely on a lot of water, continue to be fed and nourished and supported. And as we look to invite salmon back into the forest, how do we support those species with a more consistent year-round flow of water? So in broad strokes, we posed unpaving a lot of these hardscapes, converting the parking lot into a bog, which, thanks to David Berge, this space was historically a bog, and just kind of reimagining different ways that we could increase green space, increase permeability, and therefore increase water going into the forest. I could take this one. So this is generally our neighborhood framework. So we were imagining on the park scale, how do we connect the neighborhood into the forest? First, in so many ways, the forest has been kind of severed from the natural surrounding environment as development continues to progress in Seattle. Obviously, this project was inspired because the creek currently undergrounds at the corner of the forest here and just outlets about 200 yards into Elliott Bay. So how do we imagine not only daylighting the creek, but maybe expanding the forest further into the community to support the vegetation, the wildlife, connecting corridors from the forest into neighboring parks and green spaces, and just imagining more ways to increase permeability, increase permeation, and further support those three kind of North Star concepts that we're driving our project. I can also take this one, yes. Okay, so this is looking more closely at the park. These are our design interventions. So Danielle, the ecologist from Seattle Parks and Rec, very wonderfully lent us a lot of advice, particularly for salmon considerations. Currently the creek runs in a fairly straight line out of the forest, but to really increase surface area and habitat for salmon, we created a more natural kind of meandering creek network up through the park. We also decided to create a system of elevated boardwalks. Sedimentation generally isn't good for salmon habitat, disrupts the eggs that are laying in the creek, and just not good for the ecosystem. So by lifting people off the forest floor, it just leads to less disruption of the forest, enhanced salmon habitat, while still allowing folks to have a lot of different networks to enjoy this really beautiful ancient space. In our project, we also generally identified 3 parts of the forest. We described them as the young foothills, which is the area before Schmitz Park Bridge. This is a more disturbed area, some younger vegetation. For plant folks, there's a lot of like big leaf maples, a lot of horsetail, a lot of younger vegetation. Moving deeper into the forest, where the forest kind of widens out into a basin, we called that the mature basin. That's where you start getting into more of those ancient trees. There wasn't logging in the back of the forest, so some really beautiful old growth coming in, which leads to what we called the ancient ravine, kind of the oldest part of the forest that has those huge trees. You can see fallen trees that already have huge trees growing out of those nurse logs. So just a lot of age and beauty in that back of the forest as well.
Yeah, and as you look down to these models as well, these correspond to those 3 parts of well, 2 of the 3 parts of the forest. This is that kind of younger foothills, showing what it might look like if the creek were daylit. And then this is that kind of upper part of the ancient forest. You can see the difference in tree sizes and topography.
And last thing to mention, so we proposed a few main kind of corridors through the forest. The first one we called the Creek Walk. It comes from what the next group will be discussing, Patchwork Park, which is currently Whaletail Park. So it kind of switchbacks up the creek, leads you through the basin of the forest, and then takes you out by Schmitz Park Elementary School. We also have what we're calling the Forest Walk, which is a boardwalk that comes off either end of Schmitz Bridge, sticks to the grade of the forest, and just gives you a really beautiful walk through the trunks of these ancient trees through this ancient forest. And finally, we have the Canopy Walk in the back of the forest, which we were, without limits, very imaginative, imagining as a suspended boardwalk, so you could go from 10 feet above the forest floor to up to 100 feet above the forest floor. So really in the canopies of these beautiful ancient trees, great for bird watchers, great for parents just walking their kids, taking a loop around the forest, and just offers so many different layers of experience to this really beautiful ancient space.
Moving on to the next board here, I'll just briefly mention and invite you to come up closer once we're done to look at what all this information is. It's just this here kind of sectioned out into layers, looking at what kind of interventions that are really focusing on the water collection, where those would be, and where those could be placed throughout the neighborhood. Then moving on to increasing biodiversity, right? A place where we can add more native plants, invite the forest to kind of spread out into the neighborhood. And then that trail network shown in the third one there, and really how those trails can lead out into the neighborhood. Yeah, so a couple of quick other things to mention. This is just looking at all the permeable surfaces around the homes, right? If you just imagine taking all those homes like a cookie cutter, punching out the private property parcels, what's left behind is all this space, right? Front yards, backyards, little alleyways. So it's really like utilizing that space in all 3 of these for different reasons. And to that end, we then wanted to kind of, Dan had this great anecdote of in his backyard seeing kind of the forest like creeping in, seeds kind of getting dropped and like cedars sprouting up, salmonberry kind of crawling its way into his yard. So that idea really kind of led us to this, which is, what if there was kind of a system in the neighborhood where people could really cultivate those plants that come from the forest? And maybe if you don't want, a ginormous western red cedar growing like right next to your house foundation, that's still a really like precious tree, and it came from this genetic material right from the forest. So what if there was a system for collecting those, taking them back to a nursery, which we're proposing could be up at next to the elementary school at the top of the forest. A community hub, everyone can kind of get involved, students can learn, take care of those plants, and then when there's a need to kind of restore a section of the forest, those plants can be put back in. So that's what this is showing. We're going to flip around to the other side now.